And of course in Scotland, this goes back to what we were saying about Calvinism earlier on. It took a long time for the law to change in Scotland. It changed, and the English never recognised this. They keep talking about 1967 as the magic year, but it was 1980 before the law was changed in Scotland. It's 13 years more to be very careful about what we did.
I became first aware of Section 28 about 85, 86, I think, which was the first Section 28, when Section 28 came in. So it was before the Scottish Parliament, it was before there was any specifically Scottish aspect of it. And it became very apparent that this was going to be a huge problem for us, because it was the first legal attempt at pushing us back.
Well, I was working in the civil service in London in the 1980s. So when it was passed and that there was a Thatcherite motion, I remember the discussions and reading the newspapers at the time and the reviews. Because it related to education in schools, it was something that I knew I would oppose. I didn't, but there was no great campaign because the majority, the Tory majority, was so large, nothing could be done. It was always going to pass. I mean, I grew up in a fairly working class background where I was bullied constantly. I mean, people know who's gay and who's not. You detect that all the time. Half of these kids were probably gay as well, right? So you're aware of it because you're made to be aware of it. You're made to be aware of what's politically or personally attacking you at all times. I mean, the kids down the street calling me Gaylord or any other name, where are they now? Who knows? Who cares? But then if you turn on the TV and it's Margaret Thatcher in her awful little blue suits and her terrible handbags, right, saying that you're toxic or excluded, but we're going to manufacture that exclusion from an entry level of politics. Well, then you know your position, right? So you know that you're kind of outlawed.
I came to Glasgow in 1989, so just the year after Section 28 or Clause 28 was enacted. So when it was enacted, I was living in Manchester, where I'm from, so certainly part of that whole feeling and fervour and, response of panic, anger, fear, all the things I think that were endemic at that time of enactment, and disbelief that was actually making it onto the statute books.
I must have been in my early 20s when it came in. So yeah, if I was thinking about coming out then, I thought, no, this is not a good idea. Because it sort of set off a whole lot of hate and nastiness that probably hadn't been around before. I think prior to that, there wasn't much chat about LGBT issues in school and stuff. So I think it probably didn't make much difference because they didn't really speak about it anyway. But what it did was it triggered a lot of the kind of real right-wing bigots, and it made this association, I think, with particularly gay men being dangerous, sort of a danger to children and all that sort of stuff. So for me, it was a signal to stay firmly in the closet and don't say anything and things like that. But at the same time, I knew very much who I was, so kind of quite a nasty situation.
You don't need to have a legal degree to see that the word promotion, how can you promote a thing that is? Is it possible to promote homosexuality or heterosexuality in that sense? And pretended family relationships was the text that was used as part of the Section 28 Act. So, say you don't pretend to have a family relationship, what would be the outcome of this in any legal case? Interestingly, there were no legal cases. It was never used, but it was highly effective because it made people second-class citizens, and that was its purpose. And it was very effective at doing that.
By mentioning the fact that LGBT people existed, is that promoting them? By saying that there are some families that are differently structured, is that the same thing as promoting them? It seemed like quite a weak thing, and that was one of the issues at the time. Councils were not sure. And of course, some people argue that that was the smartness of Thatcher to do it that way. By making it weak, people were too scared. Therefore, they defaulted by self-censoring and not doing it. There are similar debates today around the trans issue where people default by not engaging. And they self-censor. They say, well, I better not engage with this because the reaction might be something.
Once you have Clause 28 in place, or that kind of rigorous machine of homophobia in place, it's always there. You know, in The Shining, Scatman Carruthers talks about the ghosts of the past being like toast, like burning toast. Well, Clause 28 is like that, isn't it? It's like that stink is still in the room. Or when there is a fire like that, or something really, you know, that scent, your scent memory will always be able to pick that up. You'll always be able to smell the stench of Clause 28.
So we had the new Scottish Parliament, we had the new, what was then the Scottish Executive, it didn't call itself a government, that was kind of Labour-led. Wendy Alexander, good on her, she just said, this is wrong, this shouldn't be on the statute books, and this is something we can do something about. So the fact that it was prioritised really quite at the very start really of the Scottish Parliament and the start of the kind of Scottish Executive activity was, I think, an amazing testimony to her, really wanting that off the statute book. So I was chair of that Scrap the Section campaign in the West. Other activists were in that as well. Jim Whannel was involved, and many, many others. It
was announced that Brian Souter was financing with substantial resources. It was very large resources at that point, the campaign to keep the clause. And I remember leaving the station and thinking, this is going to be a huge thing for us. And in some ways this will surpass the danger of the 1980s Section 28, because if we lose this in Scotland in 2000, 2001, and they do keep the clause, Scotland goes back. It's not just gay and lesbian people that suffer, but the whole country would suffer, because it would turn the country backward into a much more prejudiced, discriminatory and a nastier place. So it had huge consequences for Scotland, but also absolute huge consequences for gay and lesbian people. And on that evening, as I got out of the taxi, when I got the taxi home, I was aware that it would have consequences for me personally, but that was secondary in my consideration to the imperative that Section 28 was removed. At that point, there was no going back.
People will often ask, how much of yourself do you put into your work? And sometimes you think, oh, well, as an author, you should try and be absent from your work. You're failing. If somebody can hear the authorial voice, if they hear my voice, then I feel that it's not worked. But of course, you are the person that's written it. You are everywhere within that work, because it couldn't exist if you hadn't made it. So I guess sexuality is part of your core. It is within the work as well. But I think you can see it perhaps most clearly in the subject matter, and probably in that first book, The Cutting Room, where it's, that was written at the point when Brian Souter was having his horrible, hateful, homophobic campaign. And I think there was a lot of anger that went into that book, partly as a response to that campaign, which I think was shameful, shameful of him, shameful of the government to allow it. So I think that anger went into that. And I think part of the joy of any success that book had was that it made me feel more cheerful, that people, not just gay people, not just gay men or gay women, but heterosexual men and women read that, and they didn't all support Souter. And I think that's the horrible thing about those kind of divisions. They set up more divisions, don't they? They make everybody feel bad, whereas actually not everybody's agreeing with Souter and Cardinal. Well, we won't mention the Cardinal.
Yes, I met him on a few occasions. This is more a question of the newspaper articles, and I also wrote a poem about it. Well, I had to respond as well as I could just by opposing him. I thought it was important for someone whose name was relatively known to oppose him and to make the point that you couldn't have a kind of blanket condemnation of gay people because there were good and bad gay people like any other division of society. But I knew that he wouldn't be changed. What I objected to most, I think, was the kind of language he used. It was almost medieval the way he used his language. Very fond of was like a perversion. He gave sermons, of course, which were widely reported in the papers at that time. And he said in his sermon that this, much as it grieves me to say so, that person was a perversion of the human soul, perversion of the human spirit. And it was a good person. I can't remember who it was, but it was obviously a good person, well known, but also well known to be gay. And I just couldn't take that at all. Couldn't stand for that kind of language. The way he put it it pains me to say so, but it didn't pain him at all. He rolled the word perverse around his tongue. He loved using it, And I just did what I could. It wasn't very much. I had no effect on him, I don't think, at all. But I thought it was an important moment to stand up and say what you felt had to be said against him.
Brian Souter, who in some ways, although he denied that it was religious, is known to be quite a religious guy. It was a very strange. There wasn't really a campaign. There weren't groups of people going around campaigning to keep the clause. There weren't seminars where they all got together. It was Brian Souter, certain religious leaders like Cardinal Winning and certain Bashir Mann, I think, spoke out on it from the Muslim side, and the Daily Record newspaper.
And I suppose in crime or in horror or the genres that I engage with, often when you find the queer person, the disabled person, the foreigner, then you find the villain. And within my novels, it's more likely to be when you find the rich person that fits in, then perhaps you find the villain.
There was a big discussion as to whether or not we should engage with it, and most people decided that, no, we shouldn't engage with it. And that's why, it's one of the things, the phrases was no checkbook democracy. Because why should a rich man get to have a referendum on a subject of his or his choice? What's happening there? That was a very strange thing. It's not happened. I don't think it's happened anywhere else in the world.
I mean, it's amazing what you can do with money, isn't it? When you've got no money, fundraising was one of the things that we needed to do, to print the leaflets, and none of us were kind of funded organisations from that point of view. Whereas obviously if you're a millionaire, as we know now, you can just buy a lot of things and support a lot of things, and kind of support your own personal views and desires as much as you want. So yeah, I think we knew that was coming.
But I remember Brian Souter being on TV and just thinking that it was just a comedy routine in a way. Like, I just couldn't really. And he's so ugly, right? He's just such an ugly looking man. It just felt like there's a kind of thing about the right wing where they look so kind of corrupted and old. Like, he looked really weighed down by all of this anger. Like, this guy's probably 10 years younger than I am. I don't know.
I remember about Souter as well that he was a bit toxic before all this, because I recall the bus deregulation, where they were competing for contracts and we're putting free buses on the local bus routes to put them out of business and stuff like that. Yeah. So he's a bit of a bad egg to start with.
But he took advantage of deregulation and privatisation, and he enriched himself manifestly out of other people's labour. So the same people that he was, wanting to fuck over were the same people who made him a millionaire.
No, I mean, he made it personal. He was very clear. And he was front and centre. To give him his credit, I mean, he went on television. He spoke as to why he believed this, and he believed it fully, and he thought it was wrong, and he paid for it. So, I mean, calling it the Brian Souter referendum is absolutely accurate. I don't have any problem with it.
We knew it would go through. We knew it would be repealed. We knew the Tories would vote against it, against repeal. We knew the other parties would be okay. So we knew it would get repealed, but I think there was still lots of uncertainty along the journey, I think. So things that we weren't sure about or that cropped up that we didn't expect, like the extent of Souter with his billboards and his ballot and things like that. I think things like that were just strategies that, sometimes you can get wrong-footed on things, I think.
And people understood that. People saw the poster boards and things around the city. A friend of mine who was a head teacher in a school in Glasgow, she was, a strong trade unionist and opposed to Section 28. Wasn't gay herself, but when one appeared near her school, she immediately contacted and made a public complaint about it, and the billboard was removed from because she said it was frightening children and frightening families, and she didn't want anyone near the school.
I think it was really irresponsible. It was just deeply unthinking. It just makes me really upset that you could think that you could, without knowing and taking responsibility, putting that kind of level of poison out into the world and just seeing it linger for years over the kind of atmosphere or culture.
I mean, they have such power of persuasion of people's minds, I think, and that's played out every single day here and probably always will be, from the Daily Mail and immigration to the anti scrap the section stuff then, that is basically, it's an entrenchment of homophobia.
But we as gay and lesbian people, particularly people who may at that point 20, 25 years ago had issues about their own sexuality, they were listening to this as well, and there was damage being done to them because they were seeing visible hatred of what they innately were, and that's not healthy. That's really bad for people.
Yeah, that was my my experience.
Yeah,
for sure. Yeah. I was living in East Kilbride. I'd basically moved from Aberdeen, and I'd come out to a couple of friends.
Yeah.
But was very much kind of running away from reality.
Of course, the process, yeah.
So I moved to Glasgow, but this was all happening, and I had to I was working in Glasgow, I was staying with my granny, and it was just, who was a big Daily Record reader. So, and I can remember the only method of transport was the stagecoach bus into town, and passing these billboards, and it was just like a torch being, shone in your face, and it's like, you're right to not want to come out. You should be ashamed. You are a threat to children.
You must sit at the back of the bus. That's the point of it. It's perpetual degradation, and it's to try and subdue and suppress and oppress people. That was the point of it all.
Because people have had to live through that. People who've probably kowtowed to it. People who've not been able to explore or fulfill their lives because of Clause 28. There's men and women living now that have not been able to kind of manifestly develop every sense that they have within themselves, and that's a crime. That's a crime.
I do remember some of people kind of round about my age, who grew up in the either the pre-Clause 28 age or when it was coming in, round about that. And they never quite got their heads around who they were. You would see them on the edges of the gay scene. They would maybe turn up at the club when they were very drunk and try and pull somebody. Quite a few of them are not around anymore. And I know of two that drank themselves to death basically over a number of years and things like that. It's just this sort of slow decline of not being able to cope with who they were. So that's what happens to people. It doesn't appear in the statistics or anything like that, but that's how it gets people. I think when we do things that damage them in that way. Yeah.
And I hadn't appreciated how much I was emotionally engaged in that until I was at Unison National Conference. I was down with the Glasgow delegation. There's a bit at the end of the conference where at the end of the day there were any extra business. Section 28 had been defeated in Scotland, but it would still be defeated in England, and I wanted to go up and just say that. That's all I wanted to do. Fortunately for me, they didn't get to me. There were about 2 or 3 people before me, and then they closed the conference. The reason why I say fortunately for me is because as I was walking back to my seat, I started to cry. From nowhere, just tears were pouring down my face. And my friends had spotted me this and came rushing out, and we went, and I just walked to the back of the room and they were all comforting me. And I had no real idea as to why this was happening. It related to Section 28, or Section 2A as it was in Scotland. The relief hit me, it was all over, and that campaign was out there, but I hadn't been aware of it. So I tell people now, if there are young campaigners, and I've spoken to various groups and people, don't forget yourself.
But one thing I think that always struck me was that Wendy Alexander's view of this, and I think she's right, is that we kind of won the legislation, but we didn't win hearts and minds. And that was always, I think, her regret, that she really felt that we didn't really take a lot of people with us throughout that campaign.
But with Equality Acts, there wasn't an equal age of consent, you weren't allowed to get married, all sorts of things, all of that's gone and has been dismantled. And in some ways, that's the legacy of Keep the Clause. Thank you very much. We had a debate, you were proven to be wrong, and we all moved on. There is a sense of warning that nothing is absolutely irreversible. Nothing is irreversible. The plight of gay and lesbian people in some parts of the world is absolutely unbelievable. And it would be quite shocking to most people in this country, because most people in this country no longer think those things or no longer have any interest in any of that kind of thing. That doesn't mean that everything is static. Sadly, we human beings have the capacity to make each other's lives miserable. We have that capacity. We keep displaying it.
I think because of the Brian Souter effect, it was, to an extent, one man's kind of mission. And I'm not saying he wasn't supported by plenty of others, but I wouldn't say it had a legacy. I mean, of course, homophobia, transphobia, racism, misogyny, ableism, all that continues. Of course it does. That's why we're all doing the work that we're trying to do day in, day out. So I'm not saying that doesn't exist either, but I wouldn't call that a legacy. I would call that continued patriarchy. If that has a legacy, if you can call that a legacy. So the more we can break that down, the better.
And I look right now at the struggles that people are having over trans and gender equality, and I think back to the 1980s, the days of Section 28, when people were saying exactly the same things about lesbians and gay men that they're now saying about trans people. I don't want them in the changing room with my kids. I don't want to be in the same change. I don't want to be them to be in the same toilet as me. I don't want these predatory lesbians anywhere near my children. Gay men are all paedophiles. And that same othering is being used against trans people now. And we have to find a way that accommodates trans people in the umbrella that is our lives. when I look at the vast panoply of the performance of the gender of women, it goes from Naomi Campbell to Andrea Dworkin via everything in the middle. And if we can accommodate all that, then surely we can accommodate trans women, because most of the trans women I know are amongst the most normal people you could ever expect to meet. And of course there are extremists on all sides of every argument, of every debate. But we need to walk away from the extremes and find a place in the middle where we can communicate with each other and break the walls down. I'm not interested in a politics of othering. And that's one of the things I'm very proud of about the country Scotland has become. This is not the country that I left to move to England because I couldn't be myself here. It's a different country. The country I came back to in 2014 was a very different country, and I'm proud of that. And I'm proud that we are an outward-looking country.
There may well still be opposition to it. We mustn't get too cocky about these things. History has some surprises in store, and we've got to watch that some kind of puritanical movement doesn't come back stronger than ever in a place like Scotland. So it doesn't do to be too sure of the future that well. I don't think.
But on a joyful level, there are great things happening, and you can look to art and literature, read more, watch more, listen more, and that's how you living well is the best revenge.